One thing that I mentioned at the end of that episode is how important it is to do what I call your scope of work. So, your scope of work actually becomes your instruction manual for how you run your day to day in the middle of the quarter, like throughout the quarter, right? Your just day to day work. And this is the key piece that I was missing for years because I would get out of a quarterly review and planning session and everyone would have their goals and we'd sit, we'd walk away and we'd have our goals. We know what we want to work on. But I never for many years took the time to actually break down step by step what needs to be true, what needs to happen to get to the goal. Do you feel like setting goals is an absolute waste of time because the quarter starts and as you get through the day to day of your business, you just get sidetracked and it feels like nothing ever gets done? Well, I've got the two strategic habits that you need to put in place in your life, in your schedule to make sure that every single quarter you reach all of your goals and you knock everything off your list. And that's just what we're going to be talking about today. So, welcome to this week's episode of the Scalable Marketing Machine podcast. I'm your host, Victoria Hajar, 10-year veteran fractional CMO and marketing growth expert, here talking all things how to grow and scale your business. So, one of the most important game changing habits that I have learned and gotten into is doing a 90-day, so quarterly review and planning session for me, for the teams that I lead. And it is probably the one habit that I've developed that has really been like the one domino to knock over all of the domino pieces. Um, and so if you tuned in last week, I went through step by step how I actually um, run a quarterly review and planning session, like the exact things that I'm doing, how I plan, how I break down those goals into bite-sized chunks, all of that stuff. But what I'm going to talk about today is actually how to stay on target, like how to actually get those goals completed. Because if you're anything like me, for so many years, I have this like graveyard of journals, right? In the beginning of the year, like every January, I'd set out all of these like really, really lofty goals for myself, for my personal life, for my business. And looking back in those journals, I have realized that a lot of the things that I've accomplished have taken me 2, 3, 10 times longer to accomplish certain things than I expected or wanted them to be. So that's one thing for my life. And I realized the reason that was happening in my personal life is because I wasn't treating my personal life the way that I was treating my professional life. So even more specific is that my work that I've done for many, many years as a fractional CMO, I've been, a consultant, I've been a fractional executive, and I've worked for really strong, intense, passionate founders. And the reason why I performed so well being inside those teams, not being the total boss with the hot sauce in charge of everything, right? Having to actually be accountable to a founder or an investor, I realized it made me work so much more intensely and the team around me so much more intensely. And we got results so much quicker than I'm seeing in my own personal life and maybe my own personal business, right? So what was the difference? I was asking myself. Well, it was this key practice. It was quarterly review and planning, being very clear on the goals and what you and everyone on your team is being held accountable for, turning those goals into tangible KPIs or key performance indicators that you could then review and check in with on a weekly basis. So this is sort of like what we're going to talk about today. How do you actually manage the goals day to day when you're in the middle of the quarter to make sure that it gets done? And it's really looking at that gap between where you want to be, where you need to be, and where you are today. Sometimes it's painful, but it's that practice that actually pushes you forward and gives you that momentum. Now, I think that if you've ever worked in a, obviously you guys are all entrepreneurs listening to this, but if you think back to time where you were in a corporate setting, for example, or you had a boss, you realize that when there's that external pressure and that external accountability, it makes you go faster, right? Now, when you're running your own business, maybe you have a coach or there's someone in your life that gives that to you. But I have found like the number one thing that you could do for yourself is set the goal, break it down into that tangible data that you can track, and and sort of do that weekly check-in. It really tells you where you are, and it can be very sobering. So how exactly do we do that? So as I said, last week we went through all of the steps that I go through to run a quarterly review and planning. And you can check back in last week's episode. If you go to any of your podcast hosting, Spotify, Apple, whatever, just search the Scalable Marketing Machine podcast, and you can see last week's episode that talks about quarterly goal review and planning. But one thing that I mentioned at the end of that episode is how important it is to do what I call your scope of work. So your scope of work actually becomes your instruction manual for how you run your day to day in the middle of the quarter, like throughout the quarter, right? Your just day to day work. And this is the key piece that I was missing for years, because I would get out of a quarterly review and planning session and everyone would have their goals, and we'd sit, we'd walk away and we'd have our goals. We know what we want to work on. But I never for many years took the time to actually break down step by step what needs to be true, what needs to happen to get to the goal, right? It's like breaking it down into bite-sized chunks, whatever it is. So I always now create a scope of work for every single goal. And more importantly, I actually do this scope of work with the key team mates, key team members that are going to be involved in the goal. So after the quarterly review and planning session, there is another meeting. Maybe it's a couple days later, whatever, we can all kind of shake it off. And because those quarterly review and plannings can be very long, they can be very intense. So at another time, you sit down and you look at the one or the two or whatever, 3 goals that you're going to be doing with that core team. And you're going to break down line by line what has to happen first, what has to happen second, what are all of the tasks that need to happen, who's responsible for that task, right? And when's the due date? Really breaking it down. I like to do it in a Google Sheet and then have my marketing manager put it into a project management tool because it's easier to share and track or whatever. But I find that like doing it on paper in a Google Sheet first is really, really helpful. Going through the scope of work with your team or the people that are going to help execute it has 2 purposes. First is if you just kind of like deliver a laundry list of tasks to the people that you work with, there's going to be a lot less vigor and excitement on their part to actually get it done, right? It's one thing to sort of co-create a plan with your team, get them excited, get them bought in, but you could also, like in the second point here, is get their creative ideas and their creative input. And a lot of times if you're involving your team, and by the way, when I say team, I'm not talking strictly about employees. I'm talking about freelancers, individual contributors, consultants, people that are working on a project basis with you. You can build your team. It doesn't have to look like full-time employees, right? But I want you to think of these people that help you in your business as your team. Like treat them as a team, as if they were your in-house team, right? Even if those individuals have other clients they're working with. So we bring this team together and we make the plan. And when you have that scope of work mapped out, the next step in this whole journey is checking in with those tasks each week in your marketing meeting. So if you have been with me for any length of time, I talk a lot about the meeting cadence and the meeting agenda for marketing meetings, and that I think I've perfected because I run a lot of teams for many, many years. And the key piece that you need to focus on in your weekly marketing meetings is checking in with your goals. And oftentimes that can look like having your goals listed out, like the goals that you're working on for the quarter, and then have something clickable that brings you to either that Google Sheet or that project management tool. And really simply being like,